Hey everyone. So today's Real Stories episode is about a student in a classroom that I'm working with, and the student has a challenge with shutting down when work gets to a frustration level that he hasn't learned to deal with quite yet. This one incident that I'm going to talk about right now, what I observed happening was he was working at a small group table with an adult and two other kids besides him. He hit a frustration level where he just couldn't hang, and so his response was to take the papers, tear them apart, and threw them on the ground and crossed his arms and sat back in his chair. And he was very obviously frustrated. And in the past, I've observed and the staff has reported that this student will continue to escalate. After he's done that piece and sits back and frustrated, he'll start to and get involved with the other students and use swearing and use threats and use intimidation, and will get up and run around the classroom and make noises and run and leave the classroom. And there's a litany of other behaviors that can and have followed that behavior in the past. And I was working with the staff that day about reinforcement, and it was interesting because I was just today listening to an episode from a podcast about growing success in self-help and growing success in business, and how people were talking about celebrating small wins. And that's where I was going with the staff. So there is a concept that I work with when I talk to people about reinforcement that I call ground zero. And ground zero is, let's look at where that child is right now in their behavior and work from that point moving forward to where we eventually want them. But I think oftentimes people make the mistake of, here's the behavior that's happening right now, and here's the behavior I want it to get to with you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to just reinforce this behavior, the behavior that I want you to get to, but it's too far away from where are we now. And so that's why I like to use ground zero. So let's talk about ground zero for this student. The student has a frustration tolerance for work. He stops doing work when he's frustrated. He tends to tear up work or throw work on the ground, and then he tends to escalate and disrupt the learning environment and involve others in problems, and creates a situation where now not only is he not learning, but he tends to disrupt the learning environment for others, and now multiple people aren't learning. And he extends his off-task time through inappropriate behavior, and he ends up getting fed with adult attention and peer attention for negative behavior, which ends up reinforcing the negative behavior that we want to stop. Anyway, so that's the ground zero. That's where we are. And what I worked on the staff with was he ripped up his stuff, he threw it on the ground, and then he crossed his arms and he sat back in his desk. Well, we have already established in that classroom alternative choices and solutions for if you're frustrated. And one of those alternative choices and solutions is read, draw, or rest at your desk. So the incident that I witnessed was the frustration, the tearing, the throwing on the ground, the crossing the arms, and the sitting back. So the little outburst was definitely somewhat distracting to people. But where I caught him was at this point, where he sat back, he had his arms crossed, and he was looking down. Yes, did I catch him before he escalated again? Of course. And would he have? Most likely. But what I talked to the staff about was, oh, look at this guy. He's awesome. He's got his arms crossed, he's sitting back in his chair, and he's following the rules, which was read, draw, rest at your desk. He's resting at his desk. He's sitting back resting. He must be frustrated. Look at him calming down. Look at how powerful he's being. That deserves a reinforcement. And in that classroom, the reinforcement is a classroom dollar. And that classroom dollar is to just basically train the adults that this is time for relationship. So give the dollar so that it reminds the adult to get the words out of their mouth. And then there's a bunch of research about behavior-specific praise increasing behavior. So I work with staff on behavior-specific praise. Above and beyond behavior-specific praise, there is a beautiful layer of depth that you can get to with people where you're speaking to who they are and you're giving them evidence of what a great person they are through what you're observing. And that has to do with the nurtured heart approach. And my friend Howard Glasser, who's brought a level of reinforcement in my world, in the behavior world, a level of reinforcement that is untouched. What I appreciated happened was that the staff was receptive to the idea, that the staff did then reach out and reinforce that student for this kind of a behavior, which was new for the staff, because for the staff, their job was, you're supposed to be reading, you're not reading, you just ripped your paper up and threw it on the ground. That is a huge framework shift for me as a staff member to then reinforce that behavior. That doesn't even make sense to me. And they were able to take my feedback and still reinforce the behavior anyway. And it was nice to see an immediate outcome that changed the trajectory. That's not always the case. But this time what happened was that student heard what I said about him, sat up taller in his chair. He was proud that heard that he was frustrated, heard that he was following rules, heard that he was making powerful choices to handle his emotions, got the feedback from the staff as well, and then within the next minute hadn't increased his behavior further and even reached down, got the papers, put him back on the desk, and the staff member reached out to him then and said, "Oh, are you ready to engage again?" And he said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "Okay, wonderful." And then he was able to stay at the group table and be a participant in that. He wasn't escalating his behavior. He was able to sit with emotions that were challenging and not go to the level that he used to go to. And so here we talk about ground zero again. This is why ground zero is so important. People might say, why would you reinforce a behavior that then allows the student not to get any work done? And here's where my logic is. Where is the student right now when his misbehavior is happening? Is he getting any work done? No. When he misbehaves and is getting no work done, does he escalate to the level that distracts other students, that distracts other teachers from getting their job done, students from getting their learning done, and engage in behaviors that continue to keep him off task for long periods of time? Yes. So if ground zero is we're not getting work done anyway, and we have these added behaviors, when we change it to let's reinforce, still not getting any work done, that hasn't changed, but all those behaviors have been eliminated now. That's one step closer to over here where we want them to be, which is sit down, get your work done, and earn reinforcement for getting your work done. But he's way over here at this end of the spectrum where it's get frustrated, throw things on the ground, ramp up the classroom, and make everybody else also not get their work done. So step in shaping behavior says, let's talk about ground zero and let's move him one step closer to where we want to get him eventually. Let's reinforce that behavior. And then the nurtured heart approach will add on to that and say, hey, by the way, you're shaping behavior across this continuum. While you're doing that, why don't you add to that student or that child's view of who they are by giving them evidence of the powerful choices they're making and the success that they're having to build their resilience and build their tolerance while you're moving them step to help that success move along. So that's where we are today. I wanted to talk about the idea of reinforcement, that if you don't reinforce the behaviors that you want to see, you won't see them. And that sometimes reinforcing a behavior that you may think is an odd behavior to reinforce, I wanted you to understand that it's a step along a path and it's not the end game. And just because we're reinforcing a student for being frustrated, throwing papers on the floor and sitting back like this now, doesn't mean then we do that forever and then that's fine and then he never has to do any work. It's one step in a progression. So again, reinforce the things you want to see. Reinforce the things you want to see at the level that takes into consideration ground zero and what's the next step toward where you want to be. And while you're doing that, don't miss the opportunity to speak to who people are and let them know that, let them know who they are inside and give them that evidence that behavior-specific praise can be moved up, leveled up a notch, and it can speak to who they are as a person and start to develop that beautiful inner wealth that Howie talks about in the Nurtured Heart approach. Hey, thanks very much for watching, and we'll be back again with another real story. Have a good day.